the legal machinery behind Native American genocide. Hitler took notes from this chapter of U.S. history. He called the Volga River our Mississippi while planning the Holocaust. Why? Because America's indigenous removal policies became a blueprint for ethnic cleansing. Hit subscribe to Native legends and history stories. But first, how many lives were erased to carve a civilized nation? The early 19th century with a young United States, barely 3 decades old, already gasping for breath. Beneath the weight of its own ambition, fresh from shaking off the chains of British rule, the nation's leaders prowled the edges of their fragile republic, their eyes locked on the untamed West. But ambition alone could not stretch borders. It would take a perfect storm of desperation and greed, a storm brewing 4,000 miles away in Paris. There in a smoke-choked chamber of the Tuileries Palace, 2 Americans faced history's most mercurial gambler. Napoleon Bonaparte, Robert Livingston, the U.S. minister to France, a man whose sharp mind had negotiated New York's independence from British loyalists, stood rigid beside James Monroe, the freshly appointed special envoy, and future president. Monroe's fists clenched as Napoleon paced before a map of North America, the air thick with burnt wax and imperial desperation. The emperor's finger slashed across the parchment. Like a saber, "You want New Orleans?" he barked, his voice sharp as a guillotine. "Take all of it, $15 million. Louisiana is yours, James Monroe." The future president sent to secure a single port nearly choked on his wine. The offer defied reason. 828,000 square miles for less than 4 cents an acre. To refuse would be madness. To accept a moral abyss later. In the flicker of candlelight, Monroe scrawled in his journal, "We have purchased an empire. But what demons ride with it?" Back in Washington, Thomas Jefferson framed the deal as divine providence. This land, he declared to Congress, shall nourish the tree of liberty for 1,000 generations. Newspapers from Boston to Charleston roared with headlines proclaiming the century's bargain. Yet behind closed doors, Jefferson's hands trembled as he pored over Lewis and Clark's expedition maps. The lines he drew cut through villages he could not name, across burial grounds he would never see. For France's sail was theatre. Napoleon peddled, not soil, the illusion of ownership, a European king's arrogant decree that land could be traded like playing cards. The Louisiana Territory had never been his to sell. Along the Missouri River, Osage women knelt in fields of squash and sunflowers, their children's laughter echoing in earth lodges, older than the pyramids to the south. Cattle farmers tended cornstalks that fed nations, while Mandan traders bartered buffalo hides, marked with star charts their ancestors had followed for millennia. The smoke from the council fire twisted into the Tennessee night as a Tahi, his face etched with scars from a settler's musket, decades earlier, rose from the circle of elders. The news had come weeks before, carried by a fur trader reeking of whiskey. The Americans bought the West from some emperor across the sea when I was younger than a Tahi. A Tahi began gesturing to his granddaughter, weaving baskets nearby the long knives. Americans swore their Hopewell Treaty would bring peace. Soldiers dragged families from homes, still warm with hearth fires, herding them into stockades where dysentery and despair festered. He crushed a dried oak leaf in his palm. Now they buy the wind from pale kings. But wind cannot be tamed. It will scatter their lies like ash. The beloved woman stood slowly at the Treaty of Holston. 1791, they promised to protect us. Yet when settlers torched Chota, their soldiers watched and smoked. Her voice sharpened. These papers they worship are snakeskins shed by liars. Young Wolf, a hot-tempered warrior, slammed his tomahawk into a log. Let them bring their treaties. Our arrows will write our own. George Washington's ghost lingered over the betrayal. His 1789 vowed, "Justice and humanity shall guide our hand." now curdled in the heat of expansion. By 1803, Secretary of War, Henry Knox reduced morality to arithmetic. Writing 1 square mile of frontier soil yields more profit than a decade of treaties. Let savages barter with bullets. The numbers mocked his cynicism. $15 million lavished on a European tyrant. While not a single copper penny reached the Caddo, Osage or Mandan, 3 cents an acre, bought imperial rights. Ancestral homelands were priced at less than dust. As surveyors carved Jefferson's grids into sacred ground, a Shawnee warrior watched from a ridge. His name was Tecumseh, and his fingers tightened around a flint knife. Etched with clan symbols, they draw lines with blood now. He told his brother Tenskwatawa, soon those lines will drown in it. As the parchment bearing Napoleon's seal sailed westward, a ragtag army of squatters already hacked at the Mississippi's eastern banks. Among them was Ezekiel Cole, a bankrupt carpenter from Virginia, who scrawled to his brother, "Staked 160 acres today. Black soil so rich it stains your soul. No savages in sight, Providence shines." He did not notice the Pawnee boy crouched downstream, clutching a stone effigy of his buffalo hunting grandfather. The child's whisper carried on the wind, "Tatonka." Soon Jefferson's empire of liberty had begun its voracious crawl westward, but empires like locusts devour first and ask questions. Never before. The Louisiana Purchaser's celebratory cannons fell silent. America's leaders confronted an awkward reality. Indigenous nations still legally owned the land. France had peddled treaties, required consent, a hurdle easily cleared with whiskey, forgeries, and the oldest colonial alchemy, turning lies into law in 1804. William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory, and a man whose smile never reached his eyes, rode into a Shawnee village near modern-day Vincennes. He brought barrels of whiskey, crates of silver brooches, and a document thicker than a war club. "Brothers," he proclaimed, spreading his arms like a benevolent preacher, "President Jefferson sends gifts he wishes, only to clarify boundaries." The Shawnee war chief, Tecumseh, absent that day, had warned his people, "When the White River rises, it drowns the cautious." His brother Tenskwatawa, a spiritual leader known as the prophet, spat into the fire, "They write words that bite like snakes. Do not touch their paper." But Harrison was patient. For 3 days his men poured liquor into carved wooden cups. On the 4th morning, as dawn bled across the Wabash River, a hungover minor chief named Black Hoof staggered forward, his eyes bloodshot. He pressed a thumbprint onto parchment, surrendering 2.5 million acres. The price, $7,000 in goods, and a promise of permanent peace. Back in Washington, Secretary of War Henry Dearborn chuckled over reports. "Savage arithmetic," he wrote to Jefferson. "One drunk Indian equals 10,000 acres." By 1817, the script had refined. In Georgia, Creek leaders who refused to cede ancestral lands awoke to find U.S. agents parading a chief named William McIntosh, a mixed-race slave owner related to the governor. Before Congress, McIntosh, who represented no clan council, signed away all Creek territory east of the Flint River for $200. When the Creek Nation protested, Agent John Crowell shrugged. "You elected him by our lights." The treaty stands McIntosh's fate. Creek law demanded death for unauthorized land sales. In 1825, warriors burned his plantation and shot him 50 times, once for each 1,000 acres betrayed. The pattern held northward. At the 1830 Treaty of Prairie du Chien, U.S. negotiators invited Ho-Chunk leaders to a feast. As children played outside, officials slid a document across the table. "Your marks here will ensure your people's safety." What they didn't mention, the safety meant expulsion from Wisconsin to Iowa. When Ho-Chunk warriors resisted, Colonel Zachary Taylor arrived with howitzers. You defy Congresses, will he thundered. Then learn its weight villages burned. Women clutching infants waded across the frozen Mississippi. Those who fell were left to sink. The Miami Nation learned the cost of refusal early. In 1790, Chief Little Turtle routed U.S. forces twice. At the battles of Harmer's Defeat and the Wabash, the worst defeats ever inflicted on the American military by indigenous fighters, but in 1794, General Mad Anthony Wayne torched Miami cornfields, poisoning wells with carcasses. Starving Little Turtle signed the Treaty of Greenville. 1795, surrendering Ohio for $20. Oh, you have guns, he told Wayne bitterly. We have only the land's bones. The Seminole met a crueler fate. When they refused to leave Florida, in 1817, Andrew Jackson invaded. At the Battle of Lake Okeechobee, U.S. troops marveled at Seminole sharpshooters, who used alligator hides as armor. But numbers told by 1842, 3,000 Seminole lay dead. Survivors were chained and marched to Arkansas swampland, a place one soldier called Hell's Armpit, where even mosquitoes die of despair. Osceola, the Seminole leader who trusted a truce flag to negotiate, died shackled in a Charleston prison. His last words, "The sun is a liar. It rises but never on our day." But paper trails require ink, not blood, as the civilized tribes packed their Bibles and deeds. America prepared its final argument, 800 miles of graves called the Trail of Tears. The 1820s South pulsed with a fever dream of white gold. Cotton balls burst across Alabama's Black Belt. A 25-million-acre swath of soil so rich, it stained plows, black planters whispered of fortunes. A man can buy his way into Congress with 100 acres here. But this soil belonged to the Creek, Choctaw and Cherokee, nations America itself had dubbed civilized. They spoke English, wore waistcoats, and sent their children to missionary schools. Some even owned plantations worked by enslaved Africans. They'd played by America's rules, but rules they'd learned bend like reeds in the wind. When gold and cotton blow, in New Echota, the Cherokee capital, brick courthouses stood beside apple orchards. Women like Nancy Ward, the Pocahontas of the West, negotiated treaties in fluent English while preserving ancient clan laws. Men like Elias Bodenet edited the Cherokee Phoenix, the first Native American newspaper, its presses humming with stories of tribal sovereignty, and psalms translated into Cherokee syllabary. "We are not relics," Bodenet wrote in 1828. "We walk to worlds and thrive in both." But 200 miles south in Georgia's legislators pored over maps, speckled with crimson red for Cherokee land, red for gold deposits found at Dahlonega, red for the veins of cotton soil that could bankroll a slave empire. Governor George Gilmer slammed his fist. "These savages quote scripture better than my pastor, but God himself would evict them for such riches." The Cherokee fought back with America's own playbook. When Georgia annulled their laws in 1828, Principal Chief John Ross, a man of Scottish and Cherokee blood, with eyes as pale as his opponents, filed suit. The case reached the Supreme Court in 1832. Justice John Marshall, the man who'd sanctified the Louisiana Purchase, now stunned the nation. "The Cherokee Nation is a distinct community," he ruled, "over which Georgia has no authority." For 3 weeks, Cherokee villages rang with church bells. Farmers tilled fields, children recited the Lord's Prayer. In Cherokee and English then, Andrew Jackson's couriers rode in, bearing copies of the Washington Globe. Marshall's made his law, the president sneered in print, let him enforce it. Jackson knew what Georgia's planters craved. At Nashville taverns he'd heard men brag. 1 bale of Alabama cotton buys 10 whores. And a legislature now. As president, he delivered them the ultimate bribe, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Drafted in the gilded cursive of genocide, it offered tribes a choice. Leave voluntarily for Oklahoma, or be erased. Choctaw Chief Pushman, decorated as a U.S. Army general in the War of 1812, confronted Jackson in the Oval Office. "We fought under your flag. We copied your schools. What more must we do?" Jackson leaned back, boots on his desk. "Be white," he shrugged, "or be gone." Even collaboration proved futile. The Treaty Party Cherokee elites, like Major Ridge, who'd caved to removal, signed away 8 million acres for $5 million. As Ridge pocketed his $30,000 scut, his son John warned the people, "Will kill us for this." They did. On June 22, 1839, Cherokee assassins ambushed Ridge, stabbing him 32 times. Once for each dollar per acre the U.S. paid. His last words: "I signed their papers, but the blood is still red." Only the Seminole resisted outright. In Florida's sawgrass swamps, warriors painted their faces with indigo and ash. The panther's claw never surrenders, Osceola hissed as U.S. cannon fire shredded cypress trees. They held out for 7 years until 1837, when General Thomas Jessup invited Osceola to peace talks under a white flag, then clapped him in irons. Chained in Fort Moultrie's dungeon, the chief carved his name into the walls. Until fever took him, Jackson's victory was complete. By 1840, 46,000 Native Americans had been removed. Cotton yields doubled, slave populations tripled. And in the gutted Cherokee council halls, wind whistled through empty frames, where the U.S. treaties had once hung. But Oklahoma's Indian Territory proved no sanctuary. As the first wagons rolled west, a Cherokee mother tucked a vial of Appalachian soil into her child's blanket. It would be the only earth they'd own again. Until even that was taken. Winter's first breath in 1838 turned Cherokee country to ice. Soldiers dragged families from homes, still warm with hearth fires, herding them into stockades, where dysentery and despair festered. A Cherokee mother clutched her shivering toddler, whispering, "In Vida you are." "Where do we go?" the soldier, yanking her arm, shrugged. "Hell's closer than Oklahoma." The scale of the crime